Welcome to Talking Points. My name is Dr. Stephen E. Gardner, and I'm here with you today to do our second installment on this brand new series. This whole series we're talking about, I think, is unique, and is one that we need to look at, one that we need to think about, and one that we need to do some self-reflection on to make sure we are not engaged in any of these kinds of activities. And if we have been engaged in any of these kinds of activities, here's a way that we can learn the truth. And you'll know the truth, and what the truth should make you free. Truth should never, be harmful to the point that it doesn't motivate us to some sort of action. The kind of truth that we're sharing in this series is to motivate you to action, not to make you feel bad or to step on your toes, whatever the case it might be, but it's simply putting out there some things that we all need to consider so we can be better in doing what we need to do as responsible human beings, and for those who are people of faith, for people of faith as well. So we're going to talk about part 2 today in what that we're considering is the Self-Saboteur part 2. And today we're going to look at acknowledging denial as self-sabotaging behavior. Acknowledging denial as self-sabotaging behavior. Now, the last time we were together, we talked about a few things that had to do with self-sabotage and try to give some sort of idea what that kind of behavior looks like. And so I picked out 4 things that I think that were important enough for us to repeat as part of our review. Number 1 is that self-sabotage refers to behaviors or thought patterns that hold you back and prevent you from doing what you want to do. It is behaviors and thought patterns. And a thought pattern can also be considered, what we call a stronghold. It could be some sort of mindset that where we have a tendency to think a certain way. Or it could be stronghold in behavior, where it be some sort of maybe a character flaw, or some sort of a behavioral flaw that we just seem to cannot move beyond or get around. And it always prevents us from doing what you want to do. Secondly, self-sabotage is when we say that we want something and then we go about making sure it doesn't happen. Now that's self-sabotage, very clearly. We say it, and then we go and make sure it don't happen. Maybe that's because I fear success. So rather than go through the process of having to do the things that are necessary to succeed, look, I'm just going to make sure it doesn't happen. Or maybe there's a fear of failure. Rather than go about whatever it is that I need to do in order to, or acknowledge the fact that they're going to be, that things are trial and error, that I'll self-sabotage and won't do anything at all. So it's when we say we want something and then we go about making sure that it doesn't happen. And that could be a behavior or a thought pattern. Thirdly, the last time we were together, we talked about procrastination. And procrastination has been researched as one of the most common self-sabotaging behaviors. We put things off. At one time or another, we've all found ourselves there. But there are people that are chronic procrastinators. And that is really a strong example of self-sabotaging behavior. We've all done self-sabotaging things. But a person that's a chronic procrastinator is one that is a self-saboteur in this particular area based upon the kind of things that they keep putting off. We talked about that and how we put things off academically. Or maybe, maybe it's not school. Maybe it's your job or your position or your role has a certain deadline and you keep putting it off. You keep putting it off. And then finally you cramming at the last moment. And sometimes cramming at the last moment, that extra energy that you're using, you get deceived by it as if you're really hustling. And the truth is that you got there because you were engaged in procrastination. I've been there, you've been there, and let's overcome that. And we're going to talk about overcoming in some of the future episodes of this particular series. So, procrastination has been researched as one of the most common self-sabotaging behavior. And fourth, we talked about not admitting when you're wrong. And this is a classic when it comes to self-sabotaging behavior. And we all know people that never like to admit when they're wrong. We all know people that point the finger at other folk when things are going wrong. That was their personal responsibility. To not admit you're wrong is a classic example of self-sabotaging behavior. So we just try to, avoid those kind of things so we don't find ourselves stuck, being this kind of person or having this kind of ego to where, you're always right. That's a whole nother paradigm because we're not always right. Sometimes we're wrong, and when we acknowledge that we're wrong, then that is a way to overcome this particular self-sabotaging behavior, and that is not admitting when you're wrong. Well, part of overcoming self-sabotaging behavior is learning how to get out of our own way. Part of overcoming self-sabotaging behavior is learning how to get out of our own way. Because the key to overcoming self-sabotaging behavior is to realize that it's the first word in front of the hyphen is the problem, because the first word in front of the hyphen is the individual that is with us 24/7. Self. So part of overcoming self-sabotaging behavior is learning how to get out of our own way. And that comes when we recognize when we are in our own way. And sometimes it's self-sabotaging behavior that we have made a part of our lifestyle and we are tripping our own self up. Like we talked last week about the individual on the basketball court where everybody knows that this guy, you don't want him on your team or you don't want her on your team because why? They don't know the fundamentals and they're going to mess stuff up. In other words, they are self-check. And we don't want to be the kind of individuals that have a history of messing stuff up to where other people start predicting, I'll give him 6 months. We don't want to be that person to where we are predictable, that people know that we're going to self-sabotage or undermine our success because of our history or our tendency to engage in what? Self-sabotaging behavior. Well, today I want to talk about denial. And denial is another insidious example of self-sabotaging behavior. Denial is a defense mechanism in which an individual refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts or experiences. It is a defense mechanism in which an individual refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts or experiences. I think in the last 24 months, nearly 24 months, we've seen a lot of denial going on as it relates to COVID-19, as it relates to vaccinations, as it relates to politics. We've seen a lot of that. And I'm not going to go into explaining all that and what we've already seen, But the truth is that what we've heard from people when they're trying to defend a position or defend an activity or the lack thereof, when their facts and experiences say something different, the facts and experiences are common sense. It's this defense mechanism called denial that refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts and experience. I said objective facts, not subjective. Subjective means these are things that I interpret. Objective means it's very clear. The sky is blue. It is nighttime. The sun is out. These are objective facts. Subjective facts means it interprets reality based upon one's own personal position or personal leanings. Denial is a defense mechanism in which an individual refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts or experiences. According to Psychology Today, it is an unconscious process that protects a person from discomfort or anxiety. It is an unconscious process that protects the person from discomfort or anxiety. And sometimes what we've learned is that our lifestyle was a certain way prior to COVID-19. And whatever that lifestyle was like religiously or personally or whatever the case it might have been, when you have this kind of disruption that has occurred because people want the way things used to be, this defense mechanism steps up because it's trying to protect this individual from discomfort or anxiety. So somebody is to blame. You're taking away my rights, or whatever the case it might be. Things, are morphed into whatever subjective reality that people want them to morph into, whether it's based on conspiracy theories or it's based on something else. The fact of the matter is that denial is a defense mechanism in which an individual refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts or experiences. And it's the unconscious, that which is beneath the conscious, that which is in the subconscious domain, that is a process that goes about serving to protect the person from discomfort or anxiety. Now let's take a brief diversion and provide an elementary description of the unconscious mind. And I think this is important because, look, when we talk about self-sabotaging behavior, we're talking about stuff that's beneath the surface. And we got to delve into that. In order to even get to the point of overcoming that, if I don't know the source of where this is coming from, it's just going to repeat itself. If you have a lawn, and some of you in other parts of the country, I live in the Southwest now, but I grew up in the Midwest. And if I had a lawn, one of the most common things that would occur is called dandelions or weeds. And so if I just cut them off at the top, I have not eliminated them at the root. And so in order to eliminate some of this self-sabotaging behavior, we have to go to the unconscious mind. So based on this information, we will gain a gateway understanding of how self-sabotaging behavior is sometimes a knee-jerk reaction that is originating in the unconscious mind. It's a knee-jerk reaction. And I'll talk about that in a moment. The unconscious is a vast sum of operations of the mind that take place below the level of conscious awareness. That's why I call it knee-jerk, because it's just your natural reaction. You just naturally, someone hits you, it just happens. Sometimes there are things that are embedded in our own mind that when people say certain things or they do certain things, our natural reaction is knee-jerk. The conscious mind contains all the thoughts, feelings, cognitions, and memories we acknowledge, while the unconscious consists of a deeper mental process not readily available to the conscious mind. So, if I've had an experience in my past, one of the things is this, is that maybe this person or I may have a similar experience in my present, and the two become connected. I'm triggered by something that I learned to react against long ago, and this can be problematic and causes me self-sabotaging behavior. Because somebody said this thing to me while I was growing up, and as a result, I find that when I hear it, or I'm still dominated by it in our unconscious mind. Sometimes we could have grown up hearing certain things, and we grew up believing the things we've heard. And so therefore, we become self-saboteurs because why? So-and-so said that I wasn't going to amount to anything, and so everybody believes that I'm not going to amount to anything, so therefore I'm not going to amount to anything. And so it kind of gives them, it's that knee-jerk reaction that gives them permission to continually engage in self-sabotaging behavior. Now that's just one example. There could be some other stronger examples or some more common examples that gives us those kind of knee-jerk reactions. But our knee-jerk reaction is not coming from the conscious mind, or the conscious is coming from the unconscious. Because the conscious mind contains all the thoughts, feelings, cognitions, and memories we acknowledge, while the unconscious consists of deeper mental processes not readily available to the conscious mind. Now, much learning, especially recognition of complex patterns, takes place outside of the conscious awareness. Similarly, many of the elements that go into judgments and decision making are processed outside of awareness. Intuition is also a product of unconscious mental operations, a set of assumptions swiftly assembled from cumulative knowledge and experience. And much of human motivation and interpersonal reaction also takes shape beyond the conscious. So in essence, a lot of the judgments that we make and decisions that we make is really coming from a place of how we've been conditioned or how we've been trained. It's all in our head. And sometimes when we realize that our outside behavior is coming from it originates internally before it gets externally, if we deal with the internal, it's going to take care of the external. Jesus even said that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, or out of the heart proceeds all of these other kinds of things that he had mentioned. And so it all begins within. It's all in our head. And to really overcome, we need to get to the root of a thing, and change it at its root. And then we'll change our own life. Okay? Denial, as we're moving back to denial now, we've looked at unconscious. Denial can encompass truths too difficult for an individual to confront or to accept. Denial can encompass truths too difficult for an individual to confront or to accept. This is understandable because sometimes traumatic and even faith-shattering experiences that happen, sometimes we're just not ready to accept it. Now, there are common things that we all experience in the cycle of life. One of them is called grief and loss. And anytime we've had some form of grief or loss in our life, it's a traumatic experience when you lose a loved one or lose a friend or maybe it could be a non-death loss where you may have lost a job or lost a form of income or loss of portion of retirement, whatever the case it might be, or loss of health. Sometimes these things can be traumatic, and sometimes the reaction is to deny it because it's difficult. Now that's one thing, but it's, because usually we don't stay there. We don't stay in denial because we've lost a loved one. It's part of the process and we pass through it. Sometimes we don't pass through those kinds of things. We might need some other kind of therapy that's going to help us with our trauma. But keeping it simple here, denial can encompass truths too difficult for an individual to confront or accept, or even faith-shattering experiences when they happen that we're just not ready to accept. Maybe you've been taught to believe that God would do certain things and that God would do certain things a certain way. If you apply this particular formula, then you're going to get this particular result. And all of a sudden, it didn't happen. And so now, rather than face the fact that I need to maybe adjust my theology, no, I'm going to go and defend what I believe, and I'm going to deny certain things, that are right there in front of me. Sometimes things happen so that we go through this process of adjusting, or this process of reinventing, or this process of reshaping how we believe, in this case, how God does things in our now. Maybe we didn't get the healing when we wanted it, when it didn't happen right on time. And now we go into denial to defend this rather than say, well, why didn't it work? Or to say, maybe God was trying to tell me something different. Or maybe I was wrong altogether. Or this particular theology is just out the door. And so there are things we can learn, that there are temporary denials. But when denial becomes part and parcel of one's life, then that's something else. Denial can be normal and part of our human experience. But when denial becomes a defense mechanism that refuses to recognize or acknowledge objective facts or experiences, now we have a problem. We now have self-sabotaging behavior. And sometimes we just simply need to snap out of it. But in order to snap out of it, we got to hold ourselves accountable to the truth that we hear. We got to be open and willing to accept even criticism. And many times, and I'm talking about constructive criticism. Many times the way out of it is to engage in critical thinking. And so some of these things are a way out, is our deliverance from self-sabotaging behavior, which we will get into in some of our subsequent episodes on how to overcome it. But here we're talking about the art of living in denial, where people just will not accept or acknowledge the truths that are in front of them, no matter what anybody tells them, no matter what common sense says. They have positioned themselves in such a way to where they're not going to hear any other kind of reality. Now, when you run into that type of individual, take the philosophy of my mother. And my mother used to tell me this: when you find a fool, leave them a fool. You don't have time for people to occupy your space. And this kind of space means the space in our mind to where they have engaged us to the point to where they're all in our head. And I got better things to do than lend my mind and my mental energy to something that I could be focusing on something more productive. Letting people in my space means that, look, some people you just got to keep at a distance because they're going to be talking crazy anyway. So why don't let them talk crazy by themselves? In fact, let them think you're crazy so they'll leave you alone. So, I mean, this is just the truth, keeping it real. Don't let people occupy your mental space, because when you allow them to do that constantly, it becomes a self-sabotaging activity. It becomes a self-sabotaging activity. We have better things to do than to allow people who annoy us to take up energy that we could be utilizing for something more productive. Now, I know that was a sidebar, but that I just want to try to keep it real so we recognize that some people don't deserve our time mentally. Doesn't mean that you don't care about them. Doesn't mean that you don't love them. But in this case, you can love them at a distance, and you need that kind of distance even mentally so that you can be able to find something else that you can be more productive about. So, I said it, so let's not go off on the other side of the road when simply being responsible means that, hey, look, this person, this argument, this position is not even worth my time. Because why? Many of those individuals have already made up in their own mind. You're not going to change the way they think. No matter what you say, no matter how you believe, you're not going to change them. So when you know a person's not going to change, why give them the time of day? Keep them at a distance, love them at a distance, but you're trying to protect your own sanity so you don't find yourself going down some rabbit hole of argument and debate that turns out to be non-productive. All right, enough said on that. So, but there are other aspects when we shifting back to denial. We've learned this about denial can shape dynamics in different domains of life, whether that be ignoring relationship conflicts or it could be something else. In the case of denial as a sabotaging behavior, people may isolate themselves against their flaws and mistakes. They might pretend that everything is fine and ignore their own negative emotions or disagreements within the relationship. This is a person that's just not willing to acknowledge their flaws and mistakes, and so they're living in this reality that you're the fault, you're the reason why. We all know people like that never own up to their own, they're never responsible or for their own actions, but they always, all the time, are pointing the finger at the other person, and the other person is what's at wrong. And then they gather people for their side. Now they got people on their side believing what they believe, all because they're not responsible enough to own up. So that's self-sabotaging behavior on steroids, where it goes out and gets people to agree with them even when they're wrong. People may isolate themselves against their flaws and mistakes, and they find other people to be on their position even though that they're wrong. We know people like that. We see a lot of that going on today. But you know that it's the role of a self-saboteur. They might pretend that everything is fine and ignore their own negative emotions or disagreements in a relationship. Oh, everything's fine. Oh, it's all, oh yeah, you know. And knowing you need to talk about it. Knowing that you need to have a come to Jesus moment or sit down and really work through these kinds of things. And one of the ways to really work through stuff like this, and one overcoming a process that we can engage in overcoming this type of, or that we can engage in resolving relationship conflicts, is very simple. Now I'm going to give you this one today. It's called active listening. Learning to actively listen means that you listen to what the person's got to say and let them finish before you make a response. The book of Proverbs says, if you answer a matter before you hear it, to you it becomes folly. We've all been there and done that, to where somebody's saying something, we don't want to hear what they got to say, and our knee-jerk reaction is to butt in, cut them off, and then say our part. And we find out later on that if we had simply listened, we would have understood where they were coming from to begin with. And there we're going down a rabbit hole. Oh yeah, I've been guilty of that. And we all have. Sometimes the way to overcome relationship conflicts and disagreements is active listening, hearing out the other person before you engage in some sort of response. This is something we all need to get better at. And some of you are better at it because you come to realize, you know what? I just simply need to listen to what this person has got to say. It works. Another form, denial as a self-sabotaging behavior, is when it can be seen in refusing to acknowledge an illness. Now, people of faith, let's be honest. We struggle with this one, especially when if you come from a religious worldview that believes that God's a healer. Now, I believe that God's a healer, but I believe that God not only used divine healing, but I believe that God used human medicine. Now, there was a time in my life that I would have been, oh no, I ain't got time for human medicine. I don't have time for any allopathic approaches. God's a healer, period. And that was my paradigm, that I stood on that. And as I matured in my faith, I come to realize that God's a lot bigger than what I expected him, than what I had first expected him to be. But there are times in our life to where denial can emerge as a self-sabotaging behavior when it comes to our health. I'll be the first to tell you this from my own personal experience. In 2014, I was diagnosed as having cancer growing in my body. And it wasn't until 2018 that I decided to utilize common sense and listen to wisdom that was coming from the voice of my spouse, that I needed to do something about what was occurring that was evident in my own life. And I did that, and I got my healing that way. Some people will refuse to get the kind of medical intervention, whether it be allopathic, naturopathic, or whatever it is, because they have a paradigm that the only kind of healing that's going to work is divine healing. And I come to realize that God made the earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. That means science is part of this world. That means God was the author of science before ever man came up with those kind of ideas. I made a shift because I matured to the point that I realized, you know what? Faith and fact can't coexist. I can't know how to get healed unless I know, accept the fact that I'm sick. There was a time in my life, and I'm pretty sure you all went out there and said that, and some of you might be there today, but that's okay. I'm just going to call it like it is. We will be careful not to say certain things, because if we said certain things, then we will cause that thing to come into existence in our life. For example, I'm catching a cold. And so people will say, well, I'm not catching a cold. I'm not catching a cold. Yet, that's denial. That's denial. I mean, the human body is just subject to virus and subject to bacteria and subject to what? For the common cold to emerge. And so to deny, I'm not catching a cold, I'm not reaching out. Look, that's the kind of self-sabotaging thought life and mental mindset that we're talking about here. Is that it's clear that you're sniffling, it's clear your nose is running, it's clear that you got a hoarse, or that you have a hoarse, that your throat is kind of hoarse. You've got all the signs. It's clear that your temperature is rising. All of these facts are there that resemble and look like a common cold. And to say that I don't have a common cold, I'm not catching a cold, I'm not going to state what actually is, that is self-sabotaging behavior. And we, as people of faith, are quick to make those kind of snap judgments because we have been conditioned to only believe one way when it comes to the one God we serve. Well, that's enough on that. And and all the things that we learned today, especially about self-sabotaging behavior, one of the things is true. In many of these instances, Denial leads to short-term satisfaction, but long-term pain. In my own life, when it came to my own health, if I had not did what I did then, I probably would not be standing here today. And I just praise God that I listened. I praise God that I matured. I praise God that my concept of Him grew even through my own struggle with what I believed about the God that I serve. Well, that's all we're going to share today. Come back next time when we do a part 3 on the self-saboteur. And maybe we'll get into some of the ways and means by which we can overcome it. But maybe there's some other stuff we need to identify that are self-sabotaging activity. Talk to you next time. God bless.